Okay, welcome Senate Government Operations, Friday, March 19th. And we have today what we're going to do. But first of all, I want to say, Neville, the accent was a cross between Hathaway and Dr. Blake, which is filmed in New Zealand. Okay, just wanted you to know that I had.
Yeah, because I looked it up. He was Yorkshire. I thought, I don't think I'm Yorkshire.
So sorry about that, everybody. So what we're doing today is, and first I will apologize. I have to leave at 1:30 for a meeting with the pro tem for a few minutes, and I will get filled in by everybody, but I have seen this presentation before. But I just want to tell everybody what we're, why we're doing this. We have and the people who are here to talk to us will let us know more, but we have a completely outdated employee classification system. As with many things in the state, we've been, it has become like the house that Jack built. You know, you add something here and then you add something here and then you do. And so HR has been working on a new classification system and trying to figure out where we need to go for some time. And what this, and the reason we asked Pat Gable to be here with us is because you use the same classification system. And I didn't know if you'd had a chance to see this or not, and the VSEA also, because there might be questions about where we're going and how we're going and who's involved and everything. And I just wanted us to start this conversation and to, so that as we move forward, people are informed about where we're going and why we're going there. So this is really a presentation and then just a kind of a general discussion about what it means and where we're going and opportunity for you to ask questions. So does that make sense to, yes, Senator Polina?
Well, I'm just curious, are we really going somewhere, or we just, in other words, do we expect change to happen soon? Not soon, but out of this conversation?
Well, they will, when they do the presentation, there also is a timeline involved in it. And there may be legislative changes that need to be made, or there may not. But as the committee that is responsible for state employees, I think we need to be kept aware of where we're going and why we're going there.
Sure.
But yes, we hopefully are going somewhere.
Okay.
Anybody else have any questions? So with that, I'm going to just turn it over to Commissioner Fastigi, and with apologies for dropping off at 1:30, and then I'll come back. Okay, so Beth, if you want to take over and do your presentation. And
great.
And I don't know if you want to have questions asked as you're presenting, or if you'd rather wait, because I know that you're going to present, and then I assume that you're going to have Neville present the information that he's been working on. So
yes,
that's up to you. It's your show.
Okay. Well, thank you, Senator White. So there is there's 2 PowerPoints in the that you should have received, as well as in the committee page online. So do you prefer that you guys can all look at those on another device, right? Or do you prefer me to share that on the screen?
I prefer not sharing.
Okay.
That's just me.
Okay.
Okay. So of the 2 presentations, there's one that is titled Class Comp to Ledge PowerPoint. Right. I think that's the one that you all have. And it starts out, the first page is classification, modernizing a 40-year-old system. So that's page 1. And then moving to page 2 right now, that it's really why do we need the classification and compensation system now? And Senator White did really set you up for that. It's 40 years old. The system we have now, it's called the Willis system. It's outdated. It's unsupported by the vendor. The vendor created this system off of a more widely used system. I don't, maybe even more than 40 years ago. It was a one person shop, and he has since passed a long time ago. So there's no support. So when new technology comes in place, new types of positions come in place, we're just really, looking at jobs and trying to evaluate jobs without the modern tools that other government entities have the benefit of. In general, nobody likes the system. It's been confirmed by stakeholder meetings. We've met with, we had our consultant here, Neville Kenning of Kenning Consultant, has been working with us really since July 2019. He did the work in the first July 2019 to December in 2019. We were getting ready to present this information last year at this time, but then the world kind of changed, and we're here now presenting this to you and looking to move forward from here on out. So we met with the VSEA, we met with Ledge Council, we met with the joint representatives of the Joint Fiscal Office and representatives of DHR and the Agency of Administration, just kind of digging at what the issues were. And legislature in particular, as well as finance and management, it's definitely unpredictable from a budgetary perspective. And those who have been looking at the budget for years and years and years have kind of seen that. Whereas, kind of the Pay Act process is pretty predictable. The state's going in with that budget, what you're approving. And that's how we generally approve employee raises and increases for that. Everyone's not always happy with the decisions. They're seemingly subjective on classification. And we have over 1,800 job classes to manage, which is just way too many. If you move on to the next slide, our project goals for the next phase of the project. Oh, actually, this was our goal for this. This was an overall goal. So we wanted to see the expertise of a consultant in the classification and compensation field in state government and public sector to provide the state with options for implementing a modern approach to classification and job evaluation. So part of that contract that we hired Mr. Kenning for was to set out a path for a transition and implementation to a preferred option, including a cost-benefit analysis, what kind of staff DHR would need, supplemental staff to do the implementation, what we would need to make a successful project, barriers, changes in legislation and collective bargaining agreements, if any, and then what type of education and training would be required. So that's what we asked Mr. Kenning to look at. And to date, as I mentioned, we hired Kenning Consulting in July 2019. He reviewed and made recommendations on a current system based on interviews with the stakeholders, analysis of our policies, collective bargaining agreements, and changes that might be needed in collective bargaining agreements to move forward. He did an expert analysis and documentation and looked at our current system. We asked him to provide 3 classification new system options and a cost estimate. And the report that he completed really included all those things. We talk about compensation philosophy, job classification and documentation, job evaluation, grade structure, salary structure, which we're finding out is not really the same thing. But we think it's the same thing because we have our classification and compensation. We're kind of doing them together when that's not a very modern way, or maybe it was never really intended to do that even in the old system. How we administer pay movement, how we administer plan administration, and project change and management. So that's kind of where we are. The next page is a picture of all the components that a classification system would have. And on top of that, you have an overall compensation philosophy. So what is the state's philosophy on compensating employees? We have a little bit in statute on what our classification system should be, and that it should provide, I don't even remember what it is, but we have a little bit of that. We don't actually have a compensation philosophy. It's kind of based on the administration, who is in the administration at the time frame. I think the experience from the HR department, and our what we need to do to attract employees. So there's a lot of things that go into it, but there's not an overarching philosophy that everybody has agreed to. And then on the bottom is how we administer the plan. And in between, there's 4 components. We've got the job evaluation and classification components, pricing and pay delivery, and they're all now in one box. And the recommendation we have is we got to take those out of the boxes and be putting each component in the right boxes. And I think that when you have questions about that, those are really things that Mr. Kenning can talk about more eloquently, certainly, than I can. And finally, we created about where to get started. We actually used to have dates and projected dates out on when we expected to have that done by, but because of a year delay, we just do it by month. So we want the place to start is the compensation philosophy, and then actually looking at all of our classifications now and grouping them into work groups and putting them into categories that gets rid of our 1,800 classifications down to a much more manageable level. So that's kind of the first stage of what we're expecting to do in the next 12 months. And we've put money in our fiscal year 2022 budget to help us with the work on that, including going out to bid on what a new classification system would be. So all that work is kind of starting in fiscal year 22, and that's the money that we included in our budget there. So if you go to the last line, we kind of looked at the next steps and where we are. And this is, we think it may cost to implement a new system in the range of probably up to $1 million once we do all the work. But again, we still have a little bit ways to get started and to know, we don't even know what system we want yet. And that's kind of one of the first steps before we move into the rest of it. And when you're looking at all the various components that we think of classification, because we have it so closely tied with our pay structure, all of those things are very much tied together. And if we want to break that apart and go for a new modern approach, there's a lot of partners that need to be involved, including the legislature, and very important, our labor partners in that, because the way year over year, and we've bargained that to a way that there's really no flexibility in the process. The process is what it is. And if we want to do something different, we need to all think about that together and how to best move forward as a state. So I think I have one more slide. Okay, next steps, which I already talked about, which is really creating a compensation philosophy to get to the foundation of what we want to do, defining what we pay for and why, and then just in general terms of to provide kind of a lasting basis for where we're looking forward in the future. So that's my part of that. I don't know if I want to stop and pause for questions now from the committee or VSEA folks, or.
Let's
Hi,
take a
Senator.
couple questions if people have
Yeah.
them, and then we can take more questions as we go along. Senator Collins has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So Beth, if I'm reading the timeline correctly, it looks like this is going to take a little bit more than 3 years. That seems like a long time, but maybe it isn't. And
Well,
maybe Neville can answer that more than.
I think he can answer the word about, but from my perspective, it's the mechanics of it are not as difficult as the actual implementation and where we want to go. So if in the end, we want to bargain something and we want to do different pay structures, pretty much now we have one pay chart for everybody in state government. That really isn't working very well for all. You look at some of the jobs that we have, and it takes 20 to 25 years to get to top pay in that job, where you may be fully capable and have learned everything you need to know and are an expert in a much shorter period of time. How does that incentivize newer employees to stay? Oh, well, if I stay here 15 more years, then maybe I can do that. And, we have, you look at our ability to retain people in the field of corrections and corrections officers, and how difficult it is for that. I mean, one thing is the pay equity, how does the pay compare to what's happening, in similar jobs across the state or across the country, but another is, what's the disparity in pay between a newer correctional officer and somebody that has longevity. So, those are the types of things that are going to take longer. I just can't say this is what it's going to be. And the union's going to be like, oh, okay, whatever she says is fine. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. So there's a lot of work to get to the end point. And so that's why I think a lot of time is built in there. If it was I think we could do it faster if it was just the Department of Human Resources deciding what it's going to be and how we're going to change, but that's not really the best way to implement change that that everybody is comfortable with.
Okay.
So,
And as you were responding, and point taken, I didn't necessarily mean to imply it was a bad thing, because now I'm remembering how this legislative body works, and in many cases, it's anything but quick. I'll let it go there.
and
Senator, you asked me for my comment on it. So these, for the size of state, are based on my experience, and I've worked with about 25 states on these sort of projects. The shortest I've ever been required to do it in was 180 days, because that's the legislation that funded the project said, but I don't want to do those in 180 days again. Typically, they take about 18 months to 2 years. The reason why we have added time here is because of, and I'll reinforce what Beth said, the parts that are required to be bargained, negotiated, etc. So the technical parts of it can probably be done in about 18 to 24 months. We just don't know. We recognize things need to be bargained. We just don't know how long that takes. So from a technical timeline perspective, 18 months to 2 years.
Thank you, Mr. King. I appreciate it.
Senator Clarkson?
Thank you. I have some pretty elemental questions.
That's
So
good.
I just don't understand this. So we have, I think, Beth, you just said we have one pay scale, but we have 1,800 job classes. Okay, so what is a job class? Is it a job? Is a job class just another name for 1,800 different types of jobs?
I'm going to let Neville answer that one for you.
Okay.
Can I just,
so
before we move on, can I just ask, do you have a presentation that includes the answers to these things? And rather than jumping around, I'm just wondering if you have something planned that will explain some of this for us. Maybe we should go along with your plan.
No. If you go back, the answer is no.
Okay.
But so I'll answer the question, but if you go back in the document that Beth just presented, the page that says components of a modern classification and compensation plan.
Yeah.
It's affectionately known as the Neville burger.
Oh,
you got the bun on the bottom.
It looks delicious.
Okay. So in the private, and if you've been in the private sector, this term classification won't mean anything, because in the private sector, they talk about jobs. So when we say we've got 1,800 classifications, I'll give an example. An accountant 2 is a classification, and you might have 15 people assigned to that who are doing similar work. So instead of having 15 accountant 2s, we have a classification called accountant 2. There's a slight variation on what they do. So in terms of individual jobs, you have over 7,000, because that's how many employees are covered by the scope of this, but jobs that are similar are grouped together. A correctional officer, you might have 300 of those. They're doing similar work, maybe not identical work, and that's called a classification. Now you have, the reason you got it, and you have one pay scale. Now that's a challenge, because the state is a very diverse employer. And let me explain that. What you have in a state is you have jobs which, if they're in the private sector, would have nothing to do with each other.
Right.
You have a livestock inspector, a nurse, a correctional officer, a transportation worker, a chemist. Well, in the private sector, they'd be employed in different industries, but in the state. And the market for some of those jobs is very different. And yet we try and fit that all within one pay structure. It's a very 1980s thing. Most states that I work with have 4, 5, 6 different pay structures to recognize the fact that the market is different for different types of jobs. They'll have a law enforcement pay structure. They'll have a nursing pay structure because there's a demand for nursing. They may have an IT structure. They'll have a medical pay structure. They'll have a general pay structure. You know, they're the sort of examples of different pay structures. And it recognizes that the market is not the same for all jobs.
Got it.
You
So
follow?
that, yeah, so long term, this process would enable you to say, okay, all the lawyers working in state government could have a pay scale that was actually competitive.
Correct. That's exactly it.
Or
Yes.
all scientists, or all mechanics, or all, okay. So we
Yes.
might end up with 1,800 different pay scales.
That's not the goal.
No, you won't. But you may end up with, like, New Mexico's an example. They've gone to occupational-based pay structures, and they've identified 13 different occupations. And so that's what it, I doubt if you'll end up with that many because of the number of employees you have, but it reflects the fact that the market's not the same for everyone. And also, particularly over the last few years, the market has not moved the same for everyone. If you go back to the downturn of 08, 9, 10, where trades jobs in some states, the market fell 20 to 40% because construction stopped. But nursing kept chugging along at 3 or 4%.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
this pandemic is a classic example of the
Yes.
disparity. I mean,
Yes, exactly. So on the Neville burger, if I can continue on that, because
Oh,
it's
yeah.
really, it's the core foundation of what's going to be different. My brief was in the northeast box, which is called job evaluation. Look into the Willis system and tell us what the issues are. 2 months into the project, I said to the DHR leadership team, if we just solve one box called the job evaluation box, which is my brief, you got 1985 system for the other components, and you'll have a 2022-23 for one component. And the reason you've ended up with 1,800 classifications is that that's the way people get money. I'll reclassify you. Now, so the accountant 2 comes in and says, I think I'm doing something different. And so we call them an accountant 3. But they shouldn't have, they're doing something different, but our classifications are so specific that they get reclassified because that's the way we can get the money. Well, that's 2 ways. It just does 2 things. One is it messes up your classification, which should be about work, not about pay. Pricing is about pay. And secondly, that's how you end up with 1,800.
Got it.
I mean, you got what, like, I'll give you some examples from other states. North Carolina, that I redesigned their plan, 63,000 employees, has about 1,200 classifications. Missouri, covering about 26.
How many pay scales do they have?
5 or 6. Missouri, about 27,000 employees, now has just slightly under 500 classifications. So Mississippi, just working with them at the moment, 2,200 classifications currently. We're going to end up at about 700. Now, I only give those examples because I want to stress that while I've worked with a lot of states, the last thing I do is cut and paste from another state. You got to customize it to your particular environment. But your classification plan has become your de facto compensation plan. I'll call you something else to get you some money. No, that should be in the pricing and pay delivery box. It's ridiculous, if I can use that term without offending, that it takes 25 years to get to the top of a pay scale. That assumes you're still doing something differently for 25 years. That makes no sense at all. It makes no sense that I've got to stick it. And Beth gave the example of corrections. I've done a number of studies with correction officers, and if you keep them for 5 to 7 years, you will keep them.
It will be a miracle.
So why do they have to wait? So what we did in Utah, for example, is we front loaded their pay movements. They got good, like 5% for the first 3 years, 3% for the next 3 years, 2% for the next 2 years. And then, so, it was general movement, but we front loaded it because we knew if we covered the first 7 years, they would stay.
So I feel like you're telling me in part that we've been shortchanging workers by using the system. But-
No.
Okay,
That's
talk about that.
And I can actually talk about, so some of the things we've been doing to address the situation we have one pay chart, but we have ways to get around that. So we use market factor analysis. So nurses, they're in their pay chart, but they might get a certain percentage more because they're nurses and we can't pay them. Corrections officers have something called accelerated steps, but so we have all these workarounds, but we have workarounds because we do have to address the market, but it seems like it really is time for us to look at it from a big picture and from the start. Maybe there's some things that we are doing right, and I think that's what we get to at the end, but we kind of want to start and build a new foundation and then move forward. So so what the number of pay charts and pay scales we end up with, who knows? It's just, and the way our pay charts work also is they are front loaded. You get faster movement in the first couple of years, but for some jobs, maybe we need faster movement, or maybe we just maybe the range shouldn't be so big, right? Maybe our ranges should be a lot more compressed. And you start higher or you start lower. Maybe the top pay shouldn't go up that high. Maybe it's more of a commodity. I don't know, so I think it's time to look at it fresh. I would say overall, one of the things that we do have is we do have pretty good retention. And I think that we've been able to, looking at it from my perspective, what I hear from other states, we don't have some of the issues that I've seen in other states because of the way the process for pay raises works here and the way it's legislated. So we bargain changes in pay, and with the administration's criteria is going in, we're looking at economic factors and what we can afford, and union leadership, of course, and bargaining teams are always looking out for employees and how they can how employees can how they can maximize the benefit for employees. And then we have a process where we go through the legislature, we go through Pay Act, the legislature approves it, but it's not really it's reliant on the state budget, but it's not really dependent on who's in charge of the legislature at that time. So you see some states where employees haven't gotten raises in 10 years. And so that just messes up everything. We're like, every time I see those things and hear them at a national thing, I'm like, oh, I'm glad we're not in that position. You know what I mean? And, you look at, we have a lot of data in our workforce report that, kind of compares our pay. So I think we're doing okay. I don't think we're doing this because we have a pay crisis. Right. The impetus is really fix this outdated job evaluation tool. And we could do that. But the things that people actually complain about the system, that's only one piece. It's not going to address the things that the legislature doesn't like about the system. Like, how come you asked for Pay Act for this amount of money, but now coming in, you need a budget adjustment because reclassifications gave you this much extra money? Like, that's something that the legislature really doesn't appreciate because it doesn't help with their careful planning of what they're going to do for the budget. What we heard,
Senator, I think that Beth just touched on the key to why we need to do something. And if I can use a vehicle analogy, you got a 1985 vehicle where the designer is deceased and there are no mechanics.
We have a few of those in Vermont.
Yeah, what's so bad about that?
Yeah.
So no, I don't think we can say that I have no basis in knowing whether the employees have been shortchanged or not. They have had salary increases. What we don't know, but I come back to the burger again. you put everything into the same box rather than looking at what each box is supposed to determine. I mean, why should tenure just be the only reason for getting a pay increase?
It shouldn't.
Yeah, and so that's what you got at the moment. So,
So, excuse me, Senator Rahm has a question.
Thanks. I mean, as I listen to all this, I'm just I'm reminded once upon a time, I think Judy Rosenstrike told me this, who used to serve in the House, that the laundry workers at the state hospital were like the lowest pay band, and they would work extremely hard and, probably deal with a lot of long-term health effects. And they were constantly in a basement somewhere, doing the laundry of like the entire state. And she worked really hard to increase their pay band back when that was the system. And so I'm just thinking about a lot of other factors that go into, besides just their market attractiveness around the country. How much do they have to travel across the state? How much turnover is there? How much, mental or physical fatigue is there in the job? I just have heard a lot about lawyers and, people like that. No offense to any lawyers, but I think there's a lot of people who work extremely hard. And we always hear, oh, well, we can't find people to fill these really critical jobs where they're in a lower pay band just because they're not professionalized. So I just would love to hear more.
Yeah, I can talk to that. And I'll give you an example from the state of Kansas, where we developed multiple pay plans, not by occupation, but by level of work. And what I mean by that is they had a system where whether you were whatever you want to call the lowest level of work and the highest level of work, their pay structures all looked the same. And so we developed, one of the plans we developed was what we called a vocational pay plan. And if in the current system, if say the market was $12 an hour, and whenever I use numbers, they're illustrative, okay? Well, because they had wide ranges, the entry was like $6 an hour, and the maximum was like $18 an hour. And I said, that's crazy. That's highly technical consultant talk, okay? And I said, that's crazy, because if the market is $12 an hour, why do you think you're going to attract someone for $6 an hour? And why would you pay $18 an hour? And so what we did was in that particular case, we said, okay, if the market's $12 an hour, the least we're going to pay, the minimum of the range will be $11 an hour. The maximum we're going to pay is, illustrative again, $14 an hour. And you go, but the laundry worker wants to earn more money. And now I'm going to switch my example, which I've used for years, is from the subway, from a Subway sandwich shop. Okay, so when you go into a Subway sandwich shop, who's the first person that you see? It's the person who asks you, what bread do you want? Well, we're not going to say that's a going rate of $12 an hour. We're not going to pay $18 an hour by sticking around for 25 years as a bread asker. What we say to that person is, if you want to earn more, move down the line, be the filler, be the cashier, etc. Now, for those who only ever want to be bread askers, there'll be a finite rate. Okay, but we encourage people to progress still in their vocational field. You follow me? So that's one of the other reasons why one size doesn't fit all anymore. We also take into consideration the physical aspects of a job, which is hazard, etc., and deter potential hazardous environment. That's what's called job context. Most job evaluation systems measure job content. What do you need to know? But we also need to take into consideration job context, such as the physical environment, the mental environment, the hazardous environment, etc. We can measure those things.
When you said that, it helped. And it also made me think about all the opportunities for bias that are built into who goes from the bread asker to the cashier, and who, like, does someone jump the line and they're going straight to cashier for some reason, and maybe everyone should start as a bread asker in that band, so that you're not saying this person looks like management material who just comes in when somebody's passed over, who's really.
Well, that's outside the scope of this in terms of that's not a classification of compensation issue. That's a recruitment selection process issue, which
bias issue as well.
Which I've not delved into. Yeah. State governments in general, because that then leads to issues of pay equity. State governments in general, and this is a 30,000 foot statement. Okay. But state governments in general have done a pretty good job on pay equity. As I said, that's a 30,000 foot statement.
Do we?
This is Harold.
Sorry.
Sure. I just want to make a quick point.
Well, who are you?
Harold. I'm Harold Schwartz, Director of Operations.
I just can't see everybody on my iPad all at once. So sure, Howard.
I'm Harold Schwartz, Director of Operations in Department of Human Resources. I know a couple times people have mentioned lawyers. We might be able to do lawyers when we do this project, but they are not classified employees. They're called exempt employees. And generally, we're talking about classified employees. The other clarification is state police do have their own separate pay chart from the other classified employees. Just to clarify, as do the judiciary people in a collective bargaining agreement.
Senator Rahm, you want to follow up? And then Senator Clarkson has her hand up too, but go ahead, Senator Rahm.
This might be a Beth question, but do we get an annual pay equity report? Did I miss that this year?
So if in the workforce report, we have a lot of information on pay equity in our workforce report, and I can put that, or I think I might be able to put the link to that in your chart, but I think, so the workforce report is something that I know this committee really uses a lot, and we do have a lot of information. So a lot of it is more gender pay equity, but they're all issues of racial pay equities kind of in there. So you can see where we are. We also do we do as the state, we have our EEO plan overall statewide, and we also have a governor's workforce equity and diversity report that we submit every year. And so that report is was completed, I think, January 30th, and I can send you that as well. And I can just send the committee links to all those things.
Thank you.
I think we lost Alice.
Yeah, Senator Clarkson had to leave to go to another meeting for a couple of minutes. So hopefully Senator White will be back soon. I have a totally different kind of question, just to move away from what we've been talking about, which has been interesting. But when we talk about the $1 million cost potentially, I'm just wondering how much of that is hardware as opposed to working with people. I mean, because we have these problems with IT around in this state. I'm just wondering, are we going to be able to work this out?
This is not really an IT project at all.
Okay.
I would say there's an IT component depending on which quote system we pick, but our system that we use now is really more of a manual. It's like a user's manual on how to do the things that Neville was talking about. Okay, what is the job content? What's the physical environment? What's the mental environment? And it's just like, it's more of a tool that we use. This would be a modern tool that's supported, and when there's new ideas or new things that come in the workforce, we would use whatever that tool was. And the tool may be an online tool, or it may come with a lot of stuff about more pay markets and stuff like that. So there might be more stuff in it, and it could be, rather than having it be more like a user's manual that's paper, it might be something that's online that we actually buy, and there could be something that we're paying an annual fee for. But it's not like implementing a new human resources information system or a new payroll system or anything like that. The technology part will will be the easiest part of it, or whatever that is. The change man,
Senator, I can tell you the vast majority of there's two parts. One is the vast majority of cost is consulting cost. But if you look on the next steps page of what Beth presented, the big variance was on the one for the new work measurement methodology and process 145 ranging to 565. What I was asked to do as part of my brief was to go out and shop for who can provide a modern version to what's currently known as Willis. And they were the range of quotes from 3 different vendors. Now I know those vendors, and I can tell you there's a technology component, but it's from a record keeping perspective. It's not an IT system. It's using technology to support the system, it's not a major IT implementation. Does that help?
Sure. I mean, I know we have to do that kind of stuff. Just that we have sort of a spotty track record when it comes to that around here. I wonder whether anybody else wants to make comments at this point. People haven't spoken yet.
This is Pat Gable, the state court administrator. I just
Sure.
had what's probably a very elementary question, but in this approach to compensation, are you thinking just salary, or are you thinking the salary plus benefits component? And if it's salary plus benefits component, how do you figure into that, the kinds of changes, for example, that are being anticipated in our pension system?
I
Right,
can
so-
answer that. I can answer that question when
Okay.
it comes. Or do you want to answer it, Beth?
Well, it's kind of a big picture question. I mean, right here, obviously total compensation is always a factor when employees are, deciding what they want to do and where they want to work. So that's always a factor. We are particularly talking about a pay system, but anytime just like when you're bargaining or we're bargaining, I mean, all of those components come into it. And so the other types of things, we'll keep those kind of separate for now, from my perspective. They certainly, when we're talking about pay, and not any big secret when the management's always going to bring up, well, we get all these other benefits, we don't have to pay as much, and the union's like, yes, but we want this other thing too. I mean, that's kind of how it goes all the time, but I mean, so in bargaining, all the total compensation packages are already going to be included, but this project is really more about getting a modern everything. I mean, I want to modernize all of the benefits we provide. I think we want, we're having other conversations about the pension system, and what pension system's going to be going forward, if there's going to be changes. And this is somewhat, I would say, the same conversation about what, but it's not real. I shouldn't be making this parallel, but it's about modernizing how we measure what people do, how we make sure that people are paid equitably and appropriately in the modern world. And just to let you know, one of the folks that Neville talked to when he was having the conversations with the VSEA was a judiciary employee as well. So.
Yes, so obviously the VSEA represents an important component of the judiciary workforce, but we have a substantial portion of our workforce not represented by the VSEA. And so this is our introduction to this idea. And so I would just say that having a different job in the judiciary, I had to learn the Willis system and keep trying to apply it. And I'm a lawyer of long standing, and I had a heck of a time trying to understand the Willis system and apply it. So
Absolutely.
I'm definitely with people who think it's time to be modernized and have it be less idiosyncratic. It almost seems like some kind of weird cult religion as opposed to system.
Just to add to what Beth said, in most of these redesign projects that I've done, it does focus on developing new salary structures, but most states ask that and this comes back to the compensation philosophy component. When we say compensation, what do we mean? So they will assess the competitiveness of their benefits to determine what their pay structure should be, but it's typically not a redesign of benefits as well. But because there's a myth that often exists, and it's quote, well, we're so competitive on benefits, we don't need to be competitive on salary. And if we had time, and I had a whiteboard, I could prove to you if you're not competitive on salary, by definition, you can't be competitive on benefits because a number of benefits are expressed as a percentage of salary.
So
Yes, that's true.
Claire, will you or will you not be looking at benefits then?
That's yet to be determined.
Okay.
But as I said, what typically in terms of scoping out the box that says a salary structure, I would recommend that we determine the competitiveness of benefits, but we typically don't get into a redesign of the benefits. We want to know how competitive they are because that can have an impact on the salary structure.
Pat, are you okay,
So-
Pat? You have any follow-up?
Yes, no, I understand that because I think I'm interested, obviously, a salary structure, you want it to be fair, not just fair in substance, but also procedurally fair, meaning
Yes.
it's perceived to be fair. And so that's very important. And the other thing that I focus on in particular is the challenge of recruitment and, hoping that a new look at state compensation generally would keep in mind how important it is to recruit people who can provide government services in the changing environment, particularly related to technology.
Are state governments one of the more stable employers these days?
Certainly are
Well,
right
so here's-
now
Right.
in Vermont.
Here's what typically occurs, Senator. When you have an economic challenge like 08, 09, 10, and then what's occurred in the last year or so. But I'll talk 08, 09, 010. Typically what occurs is the private sector turns down first, which reduces revenue for the public sector. So they turned out, any impact turns down second. The private sector comes out first, the public sector comes out second.
Sure.
There have been layoffs and I'll jump to the last year. There have been layoffs in the public sector. The unfortunate thing was COVID hit just as revenues in state governments were looking really good. Salary increases were looking good, budgets were looking good. So the outcome from this, I can't predict, but the days of saying a public sector employee for life have gone. That's not the case in terms of by that I meant from a surety of employment perspective.
Well, that's true across the economy, though. It used to be people had a job and they kept a job for 20, 30 years. Now
Yeah.
people change jobs so frequently.
Well, if now it's 9 jobs by 40,
9 jobs by 40.
that's the average. That was
Wow.
pre-COVID, but it was 9 jobs by 40.
Did you put your hand up, Ms. Pope? Okay,
I'm
sorry.
fine.
Okay. I just want to talk a little bit about how closely the VSA will be involved in this process as well. I know you're going to deal with a lot of stakeholders, but can you talk a little bit about the role of the VSA from your point of view in this process?
From my perspective, I think that one of the things that we've done is we've kind of mapped out all the various components of if we were to change this section, does a policy need to change? Does a law need to change? Or does a collective bargaining agreement need to change? So we've actually mapped out, that was part of the project that we had Mr. Kenning do. We have like spreadsheets of whether, of these various components and what's kind of governing them. So the VSEA is going to need to be involved every step of the way. And there's certain things that we could do, I would say, if we wanted to, without I would say cooperation or without bargaining. There would be certain components that we could do, but because our collective bargaining agreements are so tied in with our classification process, that would be really difficult to do anything without VSEA input and I think that we are expecting, and we brought them in early in the process to find out, what. We know that people don't like the system that we have, but in particular, what various constituencies don't like about it. So yeah, we will definitely need to have our union partners included and involved, because especially if we want to move forward with addressing pay issues that we have.
Sure.
Senator, typically when you do a project like this, you form a project steering committee, and I encourage that all the key stakeholders be on that project steering committee. And then that, from my recommendation, would include the VSEA. You can't do it in isolation from them.
Is there such a steering committee yet, or has that not happened yet?
It'd be down the road, once we get the project commenced. It'll be one of the first steps.
Any other comments or questions from the committee members? Senator Callamore?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And I do want to hear from Tom. Neville, I'm curious, we're talking about state government. Have you done work for the private sector as well? A big, huge corporation that also has to structure the way that they pay their own employees, or are you pretty much a government expert?
No, I prior to forming my own business 8 years ago, I worked for the Hay Group, which was a major player in this field, and worked in both the public and the private. So I've worked in both the public and private sector. My fields of expertise in the private sector was the utility industry, the food industry, the airline industry, the oil and gas industry. So I've worked across multiple sectors.
And you mentioned some of the other states that you either are currently working with or have. Have any of the New England states obtained your services?
Yes. And you cut out briefly, but I think your question was New England states. So I worked with New Hampshire in the late 90s. I worked with Maine a couple of years ago. So there's 2 examples.
Thank you.
Just curious, where do you work out of?
Where's my home office?
Yeah, just curious.
Palm Springs, California, where it's 88 degrees today.
I was going to say doesn't sound bad from this point. Well, we're going to push it into the 40s tomorrow. So,
yeah.
Tom, do you want to add anything to this conversation at this point, Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. For the record, Tom Adlenor, Vermont State Employees Association. I guess I would say that as Commissioner Fastigi alluded to a moment ago, the VSEA is eager to be a part of these discussions on an ongoing basis. We viewed this meeting today as mostly informational in nature. Several of my colleagues who are experts in classification, both in the Willis system and in classification more generally speaking, are watching via YouTube today, as are some of our member leaders who have expertise in this field. And I have no doubt that our members will very much look to be actively engaged in the process as it continues. As the commissioner said a few moments ago, certainly there are structural and procedural reasons that the VSEA needs to be involved as we go forward. But beyond that, picking up on a comment that Court Administrator Gable made a couple of moments ago, as I'm sure all of the members of the committee appreciate, there is an aspect of wanting to ensure procedural fairness going forward and a perception of propriety and of engagement. And we will stand ready as the conversation continues to engage in that process and make sure that any action that's taken, if an action is taken, is one that our members have had an opportunity to lend our considerable expertise to. So I appreciate the invitation to be here today, and we stand ready to continue this conversation moving forward.
Great. So I propose that we begin to wrap up this conversation, if that's okay with folks. We have another meeting that we have to, another conversation we have to be engaged in shortly. But I wonder, my question is sort of, what are the next steps after today? You don't need anything from us, I take it, but I'm just curious, what would you say your next steps are?
Our next steps are, we do need some funding to start moving forward, and we put $125,000 in our budget. Actually, it's a bump up of $109,000. I do not believe that money will be coming over in the budget that the House will be sending over. I guess my plea to the Senate is to put that funding back in so we won't get another year behind.
Did they choose to take it out, or was it never on the table?
Well,
in the House?
House Gov Ops really hasn't had a chance to even look at this issue yet. So I think it was House Appropriations wanted to have House Gov Ops weigh in, and they just, with all the other work they're doing with related to pensions, they just haven't had any time to focus on it.
Right.
I don't
So
think they're
you-
necessarily opposed in general. I just think they just want more information and want input from House Gov Ops.
So do you have that somewhere in writing at all, or just, have you made a request at all?
It's in our budget.
Okay, it's in your budget. Okay,
It's in our budget. Yeah.
thanks.
And just to add that Beth, this group also met with Jane Kitchell and myself the other
Okay,
day. So Appropriations is aware of this request.
okay. All right, well, if there's no other comments or questions, I would say au revoir, or something like that. Thanks a lot for coming in. I
Thank you,
appreciate it. Appreciate
everybody.
the fact that we're undertaking this work. It's really long overdue, as you well know and said very articulately. It's time we get behind this and make the changes that we need to make. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
So, Mr. Vice Chair, could we take a maybe 10-minute break?
I don't know, the slave driver's here.
Oh,
Oh,
because
God.
Allison isn't back yet either.
That's true. We have to wait for Allison. Well, the next
So-
the next group is coming in at 2:30. So yeah, we have time.
Yeah. Yeah, let's take a little break. Thanks.
Actually,
Thanks
well,
for-
well,
was
I
that
got time.
helpful?
yes, yeah.
Okay,
Senator Polina did a perfect job. Perfect.
I figured he would. All right, so let's take a break.
How long?
Let's come back at let's do 10 minutes. We'll come back right before 2:30 because then that's when they're going to come and join.